Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by...
From Houston, Texas, it's Bob Bazanko.
And as folks know, we've been covering the protests around the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC. We've done a couple shows on it. I personally was pretty involved in the organizing. And so we're doing some follow-up episodes to APEC, and then also talking and getting some of the stories of some of the participants and people who have been impacted by APEC itself. And so today we're joined by Brandon Lee, who is a environmentalist and indigenous rights activist who is based in San Francisco. He's a member of the San Francisco Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines and was a recipient of Environmental Concerns Environmental Hero Award in 2020. As many of you are aware, the Philippines is one of the deadliest countries in the world for environmental defenders, with 30 environmentalists murdered there in 2018. But every year is a year where we see environmental defenders and land defenders murdered and injured and threatened and harmed by often the government. And there was a lot of media around former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, who had notoriously called land and environmental activists communist sympathizers and terrorists. And now we have a new Filipino president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., son of notorious dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So Brandon's going to be joining us today to talk about the Philippines and talk some about APEC. Brandon, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thank you, Scott. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Maybe you could just start. You were in the Philippines doing organizing and some journalism, and then some things happened to you. So maybe you want to just start off with telling us a little bit about your story of what you were doing in the Philippines and what happened to you.
Sure. First of all, I'm not Filipino. I am a Chinese American born and raised in San Francisco in the Sunset District. I got involved with Filipino issues when I first joined the Afghanistan war protests in 2001, as there was a war on resources for the U.S. and its multinational corporations to gain access to oil. And from there, Afghanistan, or the Philippines, was declared the second front on terror by our president then, George Bush. And I started to get to know the Philippines through reading about it, through joining organizations to advocate for national liberation through the League of Filipino Students at San Francisco State. And eventually I found my way to the Philippines in 2007 when I went on my first exposure trip. And there we joined the different sectors, the workers, the peasants, and the indigenous peoples. And for myself, I found myself gravitating toward the indigenous struggle to preserve their ancestral lands from multinational corporations and militarization. And in 2010, I made the bold move to the Cordillera region, particularly in Ifugao, which is in the northern part of the Philippines. And yes, I wrote about my experiences, what I saw, the militarization, the impacts of these dams and mines to the indigenous peoples themselves, and found myself to be on the eyes of the government through the militarization. They start to red tag me, which in essence is like terror tagging us, saying we are terrorists by getting involved in helping indigenous peoples. And I was under surveillance for a number of years. And ultimately in 2019, on August 6th, I was on the receiving end of an assassination attempt, and 4 bullets entered, and I'm now quadriplegic. I have no sensation or movements from my chest down. I have no hand motor functions. And this is happening to a lot of people in the Philippines who are activists, who dissent from what government wants and their policies and programs.
First thing, I'm sorry that happened to you. That's so terrible. I'm sorry. I've known about you for a while and got to know you a little bit through this APEC organizing. So I'm terribly sorry that happened. I guess my follow-up question would be, working with these indigenous communities in different parts of the Philippines, why do they want to harass land defenders and environmental defenders, and why do they do things like assassination attempts on activists? What is the gain for them out of this?
They're pushing a lot of the neoliberal policies. So for peasants, they just want a little land to farm, which historically none of the land that they're farming belongs to them. They're working plots of land that their grandmothers have been working for, and generations before them have been working on. And all they want is a little piece of land. For workers, it's just better working conditions and welfare. And these neoliberal policies actually weaken the labor laws in these countries like the Philippines. And for the indigenous people, it's just their right to their ancestral land and their right to self-determination. But they're considered squatters in their own ancestral land because the government sees that any land with the slope of 18 degrees or more as government land. So what the government wants to do with these hillsides or mountains, they want to use it for resource extraction. So instead of protecting the people themselves, the government wants to make money for these corporations, for these rich landlords who happen to be the politicians themselves.
What are the resources involved in these indigenous lands? What are they trying to extract there?
It's rich in natural resources such as gold, silver, copper, magnesium, and nickel, just to name a few. And then, of course, it's a great abundance of natural resources in the rivers, which companies come in to dam.
And there are multinationals there from other countries, American companies, et cetera.
So it's mostly from first world countries, those that already produce a lot of the pollution around the world. And they come in and they want to offer like their expertise in renewable energy, like American, Australian, Norwegian companies. And yeah, and they're also the ones that contribute to the global warming through mining companies.
One question I have is, somewhat familiar with how American like oil companies and mining companies like operate. They not only work with like government entities and government police agencies and things like that, but they also work with what I would call like extrajudicial groups of people, like paramilitaries and things like that. Like I'm like familiar with that in like Mexico and Indonesia and places like that. Is that also part of the case? Do we have like non-government paramilitary types working for these companies as well as security or things like that?
Yes, oftentimes these companies hire their own private security, and they oftentimes get partnered with the Philippine security forces, whether that's the Philippine National Police or the Philippine military themselves, or the CAFGU, which is the Philippines paramilitary group. And these groups are considered the investment defense force. They protect the interests of investment rather than the civilians themselves.
Did the level of violence escalate with Duterte, or was there already high levels of violence before he was elected?
The cases of extrajudicial killings changed between presidents. Under Marcos, the first dictator in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of extrajudicial killings and abductions and arrests, illegal detentions. And then under Cory Aquino, the next president after Marcos, those numbers dropped, but there were other kinds of conflicts like surveillance and threats. And then we have different presidencies like Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo during the early 2000s until 2010 with 1,200 extrajudicial killings of activists. So we go back to Duterte's time, which is just 6 years of presidency. He already got 450 extrajudicial killings of political activists. But the killings of the urban poor under the guise of the drug war was estimated to be more than 30,000.
And has that been continuing with Marcos Jr.? What's Marcos
Right.
Jr.'s nickname? Bong Bong, right?
Yes, Marcos Jr. nickname is Bong Bong Marcos. He tried to distance himself from Duterte by saying more rosy words and not defamatory words toward women. He postures himself as a green president, but he actually carries a lot of the same policies as his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, which is expansion into the Build program, which Marcos calls Build Better More. And with the killings, the drug war, he still continues that program as well.
Before this horrible assassination attempt, had you already been in conflict with the government? You had a record, so you said that you were on their radar. So what kind of stuff were they doing you before that?
Okay, in 2014, they red tagged me on social media, on Facebook. They put my picture along with 9 other Ifugao peasant movement members as members of the New People's Army, which is the armed rebel group in the Philippines fighting for national liberation. And so that's my first direct red tagging. In 2015, I was given a brown envelope addressed to myself with my address as Dugong Ifugao, which is where I lived, /NorCal. So they did surveil my background a bit, even knowing our acronym of Northern California as NorCal. And then in 2016, they followed me from Tiger Hill Detention Facility, which is where the district jail is, where I serve political prisoners. And they followed me to my office and then to a nearby inn, just gathering intelligence on what I'm doing. And then in 2017, I grabbed a intelligence officer phone who was taking pictures of our group before going to the Cordillera Day, where we celebrate the indigenous people's struggles and look for ways where we can help each other. And when I did that, on our way to the Cordillera Day in Kalinga, which was more than 14 hours away, we were stopped at a checkpoint manned by both the Philippine National Police and the Philippine military. None of the officers who manned the checkpoint were wearing their name tags, and it was in the dead of night where the signal reception was nil, and they asked me to alight the bus to search my bag because they had top-level intelligence that I was carrying a gun with bullets. At one point, when I protested that they have no warrant to search, they said, we can wait all night or you can come with us to the police station alone. And I refused, and they said, okay, we'll just search your bag then. And when they had me remove the contents of my bag, at one point the floodlights went off. And that was for roughly 10 to 15 seconds. And my colleagues on the bus told me to close my bag because the police are known to plant guns, bullets, or even drugs, which can get you in a lot of trouble. And then, in 2018, flyers and posters went up about myself and my colleagues in the Ifugao peasant movement that we are communist supporters. We're recruiting the students to join the New People's Army, the armed rebel group, and even targeted my wife as a contact of the New People's Army. And up until the last several months before they shot me, they visited me in my home and office. And when they could not find me, they were asking my family and my colleagues, where's my whereabouts? How much was I making? What school does my daughter go to? And things that they were using to profile me until that fateful day on August 6th.
When you mentioned these attacks and killings, are these being done? You mentioned the National Police. Are these being carried out by state forces like the police and the military? Or there are also like paramilitaries and private forces involved in this kind of repression and this surveillance?
Usually it's the state forces themselves, but for my colleague, William Bugatti, he was under surveillance by the paramilitary themselves until he was shot on March 24, 2014. And Ricardo Mayumi on March 2nd, 2018, he was shot by state agents, but we're not sure if it's the paramilitary or the military themselves, but both at nighttime as well as myself.
Now, you're a U.S. citizen. Did the American embassy or consulates or anybody, did you talk to them or did they reach out or were they a problem for you?
I wasn't able to speak at that time because they puncture a hole under my neck so I can breathe. And they put me on a ventilator from that attack. But the U.S. government through the U.S. embassy reached out only because there were people demanding the U.S. do something for my case. A lot of activists here in the U.S. was demanding that the U.S. help out.
There's a lot of groups based in California and the Bay Area, which are Filipino groups in solidarity with folks who are doing that work. Was there a big uproar from Bayan groups, et cetera, on the ground after the assassination attempt, trying to get the State Department or the U.S. government to pay attention?
Yes, they reached out to Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, and Dianne Feinstein. The only one that remotely entertained any government response was Nancy Pelosi, who tweeted that the Philippine government should investigate this. But that was it. None of the three really looked into the case much.
We see the government trying to connect armed rebel groups to social movements. We've seen that in a lot of different parts of the world, and assassination attempts, abductions, things like that. With the people in Cordillera, how much is that a part of everyday life? How much harassment are they getting on a daily basis? I guess either from state forces or from paramilitary forces.
So since I was shot, the Philippine government enacted the anti-terror law, and that pretty much was based on our Patriot Act and Australia's anti-terror law and Europe's anti-terror law. So they put all these vague definitions together, and they said anyone that protests the government and causes a disruption to people's daily lives can be tagged as a terrorist. Since that time, there have been a number of activists around the Philippines that have been tagged as terrorists, including 4 of my friends in the Cordillera People's Alliance. One of my friends, Steve Tauli, was actually abducted in November of 2022 and released the next day because of public clamor that the military releases him. And there's another 2 activists that were abducted in March of 2023. Government already surfaced pictures of them alive, but they're denying that they have them in custody. We're saying, how did you have these pictures if you don't have them in custody? And until today, they're still missing, and they still refuse that they have them in custody. Aside from those, phosphorus bombs were dropped in 2017 and 2023 in the province of Abra and Kalinga. And a lot of the U.S. military money, aid, and weapons actually goes to the Philippines, as well as Israeli arms and weapons also goes to the Philippines. And they're being trained by both the IDF and the U.S. military. So for me, I can safely say that the bullets likely lodged in my body was paid by our tax dollars.
Have any like outside groups, NGOs, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or the UN, or taken any interest in what's happening with indigenous activists
Oh yeah, Amnesty International. There are a lot of international groups, green groups, environmental groups, indigenous peoples groups around the world that have taken notice, that have been pressuring the US, pressuring the UN to do something about it. But as much solidarity as there is, it hasn't really budged the Philippine government. But they know they are being watched by all these outside organizations pushing the US and the UN.
Are organizations like international human rights organizations like Amnesty or I know Global Witness actually does the report on environmental defenders every year. Are they able to operate in the Philippines, or are they on the ground there? And if are they receiving harassment as well, or is the fact that they're like an international organization give them a more protected status?
They do their investigation. They talk to the organizations themselves, and then they talk to government, and they release their findings. Whether government does anything with the findings, that's up to them. Usually they don't really acknowledge it. They just say our human rights record stands. It's improving year over year.
And the Philippines has been a long recipient of U.S. aid, but since 9/11, it was because there's Muslim communities in the Philippines, which the U.S. wants to fight in the war on terror. And then more recently, we're starting to see a new build out of U.S. military capacity in the Philippines, mostly around the containing of China. And I'm wondering how that is influencing the government's war on social movements and communities and indigenous communities.
you're right. Since 2001, the U.S. has tagged the Philippines as its second front on terror. But actually, where the Moro Muslims live, that's resource-rich area. And they see it as up to $5 billion investments of minerals there and plantations. And they see it as untapped resource. And then with EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, passed under former President Aquino and Barack Obama's time, it allowed the U.S. to come back into the Philippines when the Philippine Senate kicked out the U.S. military bases in 1991. And when they did that, the U.S. signed another treaty with the Philippines, which allowed a rotating base of troops coming in to the Philippines. Under EDCA, that allowed the U.S. to use the Philippine military bases as a base inside their base. So they don't have to pay electricity or water. They just have to pay for the maintenance of the facility itself. And yes, you're right, it is to contain China economically and militarily. The U.S. wants to impose itself on trade and the resources around that region.
There was a time after the volcanic explosion where the U.S. bases moved out. I'm assuming now the U.S. presence is back where it used to be.
So back then, there weren't that many U.S. bases, but there were a lot of U.S. troops.
Yeah, Clark and Subic were the big ones, right?
Right, those were the major ones.
Yeah.
Now, under EDCA, they had 5 already proposed U.S. military bases all over the Philippines. The recent 4 was signed this February, which postures itself facing China. And one of the U.S. military bases will be built in Gamu, Isabela, the home of the 54th Infantry Battalion, which is the battalion that shot myself and killed 2 of my colleagues, William Bugatti and Ricardo Mayumi.
I was going to actually shift a little bit to some APEC-related questions. Penned a great article actually on the day of one of the big protests 2 weeks ago in the nation, telling your story and making the connections between what happened to you and what happens to communities on the ground in the Philippines, to APEC and the Marcos government. And so I guess my first question is, how are trade policies like the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation has been pushing, IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is the agreement that actually the Biden administration just put on hold, but has been trying to negotiate. How is that influencing what's going on the ground in the Philippines, I guess would be a first question.
Okay, the IPEF is mainly there to counter China's RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program. That's China's trade policy in the region. IPEF would have taken those countries that worked with China and made them trade exclusively with the US. With APEC, they push a lot of the neoliberal policies, which denationalizes industries, privatizes industries, liberalizes industries like mining. With the Mining Act of 1995, it allowed 100% foreign corporate profit off of indigenous people's land, which exacerbated the climate crisis in the world, flattening mountains and forests just to benefit the corporate pockets, and displaces indigenous communities. And when indigenous peoples protest, they're met with state violence. Like in my case, it started with threats, harassment, surveillance, red tagging, terror tagging, and then to the point where they want to neutralize me completely. They're doing this around the whole country. They profile activists, and whether the form of neutralization is abduction or fabricating cases against activists and falsifying evidence against them, or up to the point where they take a life. It's not easy to be an environmentalist or an activist in the Philippines, but people are doing it because it means a matter of life or death for them.
I guess my other question is that I've been thinking about is that, and there's a number of actually corporate sponsors of APEC, which are directly doing business with the Filipino government. I wonder if you could talk about some of those. I think companies like Boeing sell aircraft and weaponry to the Filipino government. I'm just wondering if there's any of those you'd like to talk about and raise up.
Yeah, there's Boeing, there's Chevron, there's a lot of companies, even Google with their AI, Amazon and their AI. It's been impacting the Philippines because a lot of the work that could have been done in the US, while they're being pushed to countries with worse labor laws like the Philippines. And they work in these underground dens with poor ventilations. And these are people just computing for artificial intelligence. When you think of AI, you think of intelligence or something smart, but actually it's a lot of people pushing numbers and circling, yes, this is a human, or distinguishing between a human and an animal, a bicycle and a car, just basic things like that. And these are people that are getting paid less than $10 an hour, or sorry, $10 a day. Yeah, and Chevron, also a global polluter, has really reaped a lot of profit in the Philippines off of indigenous people's lands with their geothermal power projects. And it's not just APEC countries that are being impacted by Chevron and these world leaders. We know what's happening in Palestine now with the Leviathan field, why Chevron invests a lot into Israel. So they're doing a lot of backdoor deals in these APEC conference, talking not just about APEC countries.
Chevron and Boeing were both platinum sponsors of APEC, with Exxon and many other companies.
Yeah, it's horrible.
I'm curious how much and part of this is because I've been just doing climate justice organizing in the Bay Area for a long time, but there's a pretty long-standing substantial coalition that's been fighting Chevron. They're headquartered here, and then they also, have a huge refinery just north of here in Richmond, California. I'm curious how much some of the work that you've done has overlapped with some of especially the Richmond organizing.
I haven't done the Richmond organizing. With the local communities, I do support like renewable energy, especially here in San Francisco. I know we tried to get off PG&E, but with Chevron itself, we only connected my story through the League of Filipino Students at UC Berkeley, who attended the 10th anniversary of the Chevron Day. I think you were there as well.
Yeah, I think it's the anniversary. They had a big fire at the Richmond refinery about 10 years ago. And so now it's called Chevron or Anti-Chevron Day, I think is what it's called.
Sorry.
I'm sure Chevron has like company picnics on Chevron Day, but we're probably not invited to.
No, we're not, but we would like to get our feet inside the door and influence their policies.
Go ahead, Bob.
What's the current status of environmental activism in the Philippines amid this repression and this intimidation?
So there are activists in the Philippines, like fighting against reclamation projects. Those activists were abducted by the Philippine government. And there were videotapes of that happening. So the government couldn't get away with it. And when the government said, oh, yeah, we're just holding them because they just declared themselves as New People's Army rebels, we're doing a press conference right now with them. Those brave young college girls came out and told the world that they were abducted by the Philippine military, that they were forced to make that statement that they were New People Army rebels, but they were actually there to fight against the reclamation project, which would have displaced fisher folks and polluted the Manila Bay. So there's that. And then there's the indigenous peoples all over the Philippines. They're the last line of defenders for the environment. I think there's something like less than 25% of the land in the Philippines, which is considered forested. And they said to have that healthy environment, it needs to be forested with 52% at least. And these indigenous peoples have been fighting for the protection of the forests and the mountains and the rivers. Now, those activists are being tagged as terrorists. Those communities are bombed. Those communities are militarized straight with artillery fire. But yeah, they're not stopping. They're still fighting back. And some of them do end up joining the armed rebels, fighting against the government's programs and policies of deforestation, of mining, of dams, and other environmental degradation projects.
That makes me actually think we've had this sort of like global movement around climate where we have a lot of people on the streets calling for reduced emissions and global policies on climate and things like that, as well as actually a growing movement, which I feel, from my understanding, is actually pretty strong in the Philippines around plastic pollution. And I'm curious, are these, which this seems like a little bit more of a mainstream issue than an indigenous community fighting deforestation or what have you, particularly because those indigenous communities are a little bit more out of sight than people in urban areas. But I'm wondering, are those climate movements and anti-plastic movements also being targeted the same way?
Not as much, because those kinds of fights are what the Philippine government prefers. They prefer to fight the single-use straws. Yeah, we're making a big difference. Actually, Marcos himself, he's being touted as a green president because he's pushing renewable energies, which includes not just dams, but geothermal projects, windmill, solar farms.
Yeah, I know there's a big natural gas build out going on in the Philippines as well, which is often touted as the bridge fuel or the a green fuel.
So with that being said, he's appointing all these business leaders in those new renewable energy fields into positions of cabinet. So they are influencing policies that will enrich them at the expense of the environment or even the people themselves, like indigenous peoples.
I think we're getting towards the end of our time and questions. I have like one other question. I don't know if Bob has any further questions. My last one question was back around the APEC organizing. It was a pretty large, diverse coalition which came together. Is there anything in particular that you see we worked for months on that, and it was like climate and labor and Asian diaspora and Filipino diaspora groups, Palestinian youth movement all coming together. Is there anything in that moment that really that you see as that you take away as like a really like good or strong moment in that organizing work?
Yeah, I remember when we were just starting around April, and it's more the national liberation groups like Myanmar Student Union over what's happening in Myanmar with the military junta taking over the democratic elected leader, and the Filipino groups, and I forget the other national liberation groups. I think CESPES, Haiti Action Committee, all coming, and we protested at USF in May, where the consulate generals of these Asia Pacific regions came together to push APEC. And then with the launching of the No to APEC in San Francisco in July, we were only, I think, 150 at most in that picture. And then just seeing what we culminated at the end in the People's Summit, like I think nearly 1,000 was in that room. So it was beautiful to see climate activists, the indigenous peoples around the world coming together, workers in San Francisco, around the US, being in the room, and the national liberation groups in that room too. Just seeing that we had this common enemy and how we can support each other to disrupt and to shut down APEC. I think it was very powerful. I don't know how you felt about it, Scott.
Yeah, I thought it was a movement of movements moment where I actually the powerful moments. I've told Bob this a couple of times now in the last 2 weeks. Where we were turning around the motorcades for the Filipino delegation or the Thai delegation, or even where they had to alter Biden's route into the summit was all just, and it's because we had 1,000 people at the People's Summit, but we also had 1,000 people out blockading entrances into APEC, and it was just felt really good. Hey folks, this is the Green and Red podcast. We've been talking with Brandon Lee, who's an environmental organizer and journalist who's done a lot of work in the Philippines. Brandon, where should people check out about your story or how to get involved? I know there's a campaign called Justice for Brandon Lee, but is there anywhere else that people should check out after they hear this interview?
I'm about to launch my website. Maybe at the end of December, it'll be up. It'll be the Justice for Brandon Lee on, I forget the platform, Square something. And you can look it up at the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, the US chapter website. I think that's iChirp US WordPress.
Folks, you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast. If you like what you hear, and check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, become a subscriber. If you're listening to this on the audio platforms, do a rate and review. It helps with the algorithms. And if you really like what we're doing, especially as we're getting to the end of the year, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really happy that we got to talk. And I'm sure hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. And everyone else out there, go out and make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.